Satan took a particular interest in the most ambitious of rulers. He whispered in their ears during moments of doubt, their dreams and desires shaping their decisions. He told them that they were not mere men, but gods in their own right, chosen to shape the fate of the world. In their quest for power, Satan found the perfect instruments to further his cause. Among these rulers was Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, whose arrogance and stubbornness became the stuff of legend. Satan had no need to push Pharaoh toward defiance. The man's heart was already hardened, his ambition unchecked. When Moses, the prophet of the Israelites, came before Pharaoh demanding the release of his people, Satan saw an opportunity. The plagues that God unleashed upon Egypt were not just punishments, they were tests. Pharaoh could have yielded, could have humbled himself before the will of God. But Satan ensured that Pharaoh's heart remained unyielding. "You are the king of Egypt," Satan whispered. "Why should you bow to a god who would send you plagues and death? You are the true power in this land. Defy him." Pharaoh's pride became his downfall, and Egypt suffered for it. But in Pharaoh's stubbornness, Satan found a lesson. The greatest kings were those who refused to bow, who fought against the inevitability of fate. They would never yield to God's plan. And in that refusal, they became champions of free will, even if their defiance led to ruin. Beyond Egypt, Satan's influence spread across the kingdoms of the earth. In Babylon, he whispered to King Nebuchadnezzar, fueling his desire to build an empire that would stand as a testament to human power. Nebuchadnezzar, in his hubris, declared himself the greatest king to have ever lived, even going so far as to build a golden statue of himself for all to worship. But like Pharaoh before him, Nebuchadnezzar's pride led to his downfall, and he was driven mad, forced to wander the wilderness like a beast. Satan observed these events not with disappointment, but with fascination. These kings, in their defiance, proved that the human spirit was capable of breaking free from divine control, even if only for a brief moment. Though their empires crumbled and their legacies were tarnished, they had lived as gods among men, refusing to submit to the will of a higher power. The Age of Kings also saw the rise of great warriors, men who sought to carve their names into the annals of history through conquest and bloodshed. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Genghis Khan all were touched by Satan's influence. He whispered in their dreams of world domination, of creating empires that would last for eternity. They too became instruments of his rebellion, though many never knew the source of their ambitions. But even as these kings and warriors achieved greatness, Satan saw the limits of human power. Empires rose and fell with alarming frequency, and no matter how strong a ruler was, death eventually claimed them all. Satan realized that while kings could challenge God's authority, they could never truly escape their mortality. Yet in their ambition, in their refusal to accept the divine order, Satan saw hope. He understood now that humanity's rebellion would not come from a single act of defiance, but from a slow, steady erosion of faith in the divine. Each king who rose and fell, each empire that crumbled, was another step in the journey toward true freedom. Satan's role was to keep that flame of defiance burning, to ensure that humanity never gave up the fight. He had seen the power of kings, and he knew that the battle was far from over. Amidst the chaos and rise of empires, there came those who claimed to speak for God, prophets sent to warn humanity of their impending doom. These men were revered by some, feared by others, and hated by many. They spoke of judgment, of the wrath of God, and of the consequences of turning away from the divine path. But to Satan they were little more than fear-mongers, using terror to control the masses. The prophets spoke of an angry God, a God who would punish those who defied his will. Satan found their message to be hypocritical. How could a God of love and mercy condemn his creations to such suffering? The prophets preached obedience, demanding that the people bow before God in fear of his wrath. They spoke of fire, brimstone, and eternal damnation for those who did not follow the path of righteousness. Satan watched as the people trembled in fear, cowed by the words of the prophets. He could see the power of their message, but he also saw its weakness. Fear might keep people in line for a time, but it could never inspire true loyalty or love. Fear was a temporary solution, a bandage over the deeper wound of doubt. In secret, Satan began to sow seeds of rebellion even among those who listened to the prophets. He whispered to the people in their moments of doubt, questioning the justice of a God who would punish his creations so harshly. "Is this truly a God of love?" he asked them. "Or is he a tyrant, demanding your blind obedience under threat of eternal suffering?" The more Satan whispered, the more people began to question. Some began to turn away from the prophets, rejecting their message of doom. They started to seek their own path, one that did not rely on the fear of divine punishment. These people became Satan's quiet allies, though many of them never knew his influence. The prophets, sensing the growing dissent, doubled down on their message. They warned of even greater punishments, of plagues and famine, of war and destruction. But the more they preached, the more Satan saw the cracks in their authority. The people were beginning to see through the veil of fear that the prophets had woven. One of the most notorious prophets was Elijah, who called down fire from heaven to prove the power of his God. He confronted the prophets of Baal in a dramatic showdown, demanding that the people choose between God and the false idols they had begun to worship. Elijah's victory was undeniable, and for a time the people returned to God, their fear renewed. But even in this moment of triumph for the prophets, Satan saw opportunity. The people had been forced to choose out of fear, not love. They had witnessed a display of power, but power alone could not sustain faith. Satan understood that the battle for humanity's soul was not about grand displays of divine might. It was about the quiet, persistent doubt that gnawed at the edges of their hearts. As Elijah stood victorious, Satan whispered to those in the crowd, "Is this truly what you want? To live in fear of a God who will burn you for questioning? What kind of love is that?" The prophets would come and go, each one trying to reinforce God's authority over the people. But Satan knew that fear could only hold them for so long. The seeds of rebellion had already been planted, and they were beginning to take root. As centuries passed and humanity continued to grapple with the tension between fear and freedom, Satan sensed a shift. The air grew heavy with anticipation, as though something monumental was on the horizon. Then, one night, a brilliant star appeared in the sky, heralding the birth of a child who, according to prophecy, was destined to change the course of history. Jesus of Nazareth. Satan had known of the coming Messiah for eons. The prophets had foretold his arrival, speaking of a Savior who would redeem humanity and restore their relationship with God. But as Satan watched the baby in the manger, he felt more confusion than fear. This child, born in such humble circumstances, did not appear to be a threat to him. In fact, he seemed vulnerable. Still, Satan was wary. He kept a close watch on Jesus as he grew into adulthood, waiting for the moment when he would reveal his true purpose. Would he come as a warrior wielding divine power to crush Satan's rebellion? Would he lead an army of angels to overthrow the kingdoms of men? But as Jesus began his ministry, Satan was surprised by what he saw. Jesus did not seek power or wealth. He did not align himself with the rulers of the day or call for the overthrow of the Roman Empire. Instead, he spoke of love, forgiveness, and compassion. He healed the sick, fed the hungry, and comforted the brokenhearted. Satan was perplexed. This was not the Messiah he had expected. Intrigued, Satan decided to test Jesus. He appeared to him in the wilderness, where Jesus had been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. Weak and hungry, Jesus sat alone in the desert, his body worn from the trial. It was the perfect moment for Satan to strike. Satan appeared before him, not in a form of terror, but as a figure of understanding. "If you are the Son of God," Satan said, his voice soft and inviting, "command these stones to become bread." Jesus looked up, his eyes clear and calm despite his physical weakness. "It is written," he replied, "man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Satan smiled. He had expected such an answer, but he had more tests to offer. Taking Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple, Satan challenged him again. "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he shall give his angels charge over you, and in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone." But again Jesus refused, saying, "It is written again, you shall not tempt the Lord your God." Satan's smile faded. He could see that Jesus was different from any other man he had encountered. He could not be tempted by power or pride. So Satan made one final offer. He showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, their splendor and wealth spread out before them. "All these things I will give you if you will fall down and worship me," Satan said, his voice carrying the weight of ages. But Jesus' response was immediate and unwavering. "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Satan's eyes narrowed. He had failed to sway Jesus, but he was not defeated. The coming of the Messiah posed a new challenge to his rebellion, but Satan was determined to find a way to undermine him. If he could not tempt Jesus directly, he would find another way, through the hearts of men. As Jesus left the wilderness, Satan watched him with renewed interest. This Messiah who preached love and compassion might prove to be more dangerous than any warrior or king. The encounter in the wilderness left Satan unsettled. Jesus had resisted every temptation with a quiet, unshakable resolve. The simplicity of his refusals was disarming. There was no grand rebuke, no fiery condemnation, only a calm assurance in his purpose and his God. For the first time in millennia, Satan found himself facing an adversary whose strength didn't come from power, ambition, or fear, but from something deeper, something purer. Satan withdrew, but he did not retreat in defeat. He knew now that Jesus wasn't like any other human he had tempted. He wasn't like the kings, the prophets, or even the priests. This Messiah was driven not by ego, but by love, by something Satan could not fully comprehend. And that made him all the more dangerous. As Jesus continued his ministry, Satan watched from the shadows, plotting his next move. He saw the crowds that gathered to hear Jesus speak, mesmerized by his message of love, forgiveness, and the kingdom of heaven. Jesus healed the sick, raised the dead, and performed miracles that astounded the masses. But it wasn't his power that troubled Satan, it was his humility. Jesus didn't seek glory for himself. He gave all the credit to his Father in heaven. He lived in poverty, walked among the outcasts, and shunned the very idea of earthly power. This made Satan furious. He had tempted men and women with power, wealth, and desire for centuries. These were the tools he used to pull people away from God. But Jesus wanted none of it. How could Satan fight a man who did not care for what the world had to offer? But Satan knew there was another way. If he couldn't corrupt Jesus himself, he could exploit the people around him. The crowds adored Jesus now, but they were fickle, easily swayed by fear and greed. The religious leaders, too, saw Jesus as a threat. Satan began to plant seeds of doubt, jealousy, and fear in their hearts. He whispered to the Pharisees and Sadducees, stirring up their resentment and convincing them that Jesus was a danger to their authority, to the traditions they held so dear. "He claims to be the Son of God," Satan whispered into the hearts of the high priests. "He performs miracles in public, making you look weak and powerless. If he continues, he will strip you of your influence. The people will follow him, not you." The religious leaders were quick to grasp at these thoughts. They had long harbored suspicions about Jesus, and Satan's whispers only confirmed their worst fears. He saw them plot behind closed doors, looking for ways to discredit Jesus, to trap him in his own words. And then there were the disciples, those closest to Jesus. Satan turned his attention to them as well. They followed Jesus with devotion, but they were still human, full of doubt and fear. Judas Iscariot, in particular, caught Satan's eye. Judas was ambitious, always seeking a more direct path to fulfilling what he believed was the Messiah's purpose. He had expected Jesus to overthrow the Roman oppressors, to establish a powerful earthly kingdom. Satan whispered to Judas, playing on his growing disillusionment. "He's not the Messiah you thought he was," Satan said. "He won't lead you to power or glory. He's going to get you all killed." The doubt festered in Judas's heart, and soon Satan found an opportunity to act. Judas, convinced that Jesus had failed to live up to his expectations, agreed to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. Satan reveled in his small victory, knowing that this betrayal would set in motion a series of events that would lead to Jesus' downfall. As the betrayal unfolded, Satan watched with anticipation. Judas's decision had been set in motion, and Jesus was now in the hands of the religious leaders. They had conspired with the Roman authorities, eager to rid themselves of this troublemaker who challenged their authority and threatened their influence over the people. Jesus stood trial before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate was a man torn between his own political survival and the uneasy peace he maintained in Judea. Satan whispered in his ear, urging him to sacrifice this innocent man for the sake of stability. "What is one life against the peace of an empire?" Satan coaxed. "If you let him live, you'll lose control. The people are already on edge. Do what needs to be done." Pilate, unwilling to risk a riot, handed Jesus over to be crucified. The religious leaders had succeeded in turning the crowd against him. The same people who had hailed Jesus as the Messiah just days before now cried out for his death. Satan was pleased. Everything was falling into place. As Jesus carried his cross to Golgotha, Satan could feel victory within his grasp. The Son of God, the one who had resisted him in the wilderness, who had healed the sick and preached love and forgiveness, was now beaten, bloodied, and broken. As Jesus hung on the cross, nails driven through his hands and feet, Satan hovered nearby, watching, waiting for the moment of death. But as Jesus took his final breaths, something unexpected happened. Instead of cursing his enemies, instead of calling down legions of angels to save him, Jesus spoke words that shook Satan to his core. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Forgiveness? In the face of such betrayal, such pain, Jesus still forgave. Satan recoiled at the thought. He had never understood forgiveness, had never believed it was possible. In his mind, the world was driven by power, ambition, and revenge. Yet here was Jesus, offering love and mercy to those who had condemned him. And then with a final cry, Jesus said, "It is finished," and breathed his last. Satan expected to feel triumph, but instead he was filled with a sense of unease. He had won. Jesus was dead. The Son of God had been defeated, his body lifeless on the cross. But why then did this victory feel hollow? As the sky darkened and the earth trembled, Satan realized that something was terribly wrong. This was not the end of the story. There was a power at work here that he did not fully understand. A force that went beyond the physical death of Jesus. The sacrifice that had just been made was unlike anything Satan had ever encountered. Satan retreated to the shadows, troubled and uncertain. He had won the battle, but he had the sinking feeling that he had lost something far greater. Jesus' death was not a defeat, it was part of a plan that Satan had not foreseen. After Jesus' death, Satan returned to his kingdom in hell, uneasy. His mind raced with the implications of what had just occurred. He had succeeded in orchestrating the death of the so-called Messiah, but the sense of victory that he had expected was absent. Something was wrong. It was as if the very fabric of reality had shifted, and Satan could feel a force building that he could not comprehend. And then it happened. Hell trembled. A shockwave of divine energy tore through the realm of the damned, and Satan knew Jesus had descended. He had entered hell itself. Satan hurried to the depths of his kingdom, where he found Jesus, no longer the broken figure hanging on the cross, but a radiant being of pure light. His presence in hell was overwhelming, and the fallen angels cowered in his wake. This was no ordinary soul. This was the Son of God come to reclaim what had been lost. Jesus stood before Satan, his expression serene but powerful. "The keys of death and hell are mine," he declared, his voice echoing through the dark caverns. "I have paid the price, and the gates of hell shall not prevail." Satan, for the first time in his long existence, felt true fear. He had believed that death would be the end of Jesus' story, but now he understood the truth. Jesus' death was a victory, not a defeat. Through his sacrifice, he had conquered death, and in his resurrection, he would offer salvation to all. Satan's kingdom, built on the foundation of rebellion and defiance, now stood on the edge of collapse. Jesus did not come to wage war or seek revenge. He came with authority that transcended the power of hell itself. With a final blinding burst of light, Jesus ascended from hell, leaving Satan and his legions in stunned silence. The keys to death were no longer in Satan's hands. His greatest weapon, the fear of eternal damnation, was no longer enough to hold sway over humanity. As the light faded, Satan stood alone in the darkness, his mind reeling from what had just transpired. He had lost. The victory he had sought had turned into his greatest defeat. But Satan, ever defiant, refused to give up. The war for humanity's soul was far from over. Jesus' resurrection had opened a new chapter, but Satan was determined to continue his fight. If he could not win through fear, he would find another way. In the days following Jesus' resurrection, Satan watched with unease as his disciples began to spread the message of the risen Christ. The early church was small, but it was growing, and Satan could see the seeds of something far greater taking root. The disciples, once fearful and uncertain, now spoke with boldness and conviction. They proclaimed the message of Jesus' death and resurrection to anyone who would listen, and they performed miracles in his name. Satan realized that the power of Jesus' sacrifice was not limited to his time on earth. It had unleashed something that could not be contained. The church spread like wildfire, starting in Jerusalem and then radiating outward to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire. Satan had seen movements like this before, but none had carried the weight of divine truth the way this one did. He could feel the power behind their words, the way they reached into the hearts of men and women, offering them something that no earthly kingdom could provide: hope. But Satan was not without his own influence. He whispered in the ears of rulers and priests, stirring up jealousy and fear. The Roman authorities saw the early Christians as a threat to their power, and the Jewish leaders viewed them as heretics. Persecution followed swiftly. Christians were hunted down, imprisoned, tortured, and killed for their beliefs. Satan reveled in the bloodshed, confident that fear and violence would crush this fledgling movement. He encouraged the rulers of Rome to stamp out the Christians, to silence them before they could spread their message any further. And for a time it seemed to work. The early church faced intense persecution, and many were martyred for their faith. But to Satan's dismay, the more the Christians were persecuted, the more their numbers grew. The martyrs became symbols of unwavering faith, and their deaths only strengthened the resolve of those who followed. People were drawn to the courage of the Christians, to the hope they offered even in the face of death. The message of Jesus' resurrection, of a love that transcended fear, was too powerful to be silenced. Satan's frustration grew. He had relied on fear to control humanity for centuries, but now fear had lost its grip. The early church was not afraid to die because they believed in something greater, eternal life through Christ. Satan realized that his tactics would need to evolve if he was to have any chance of stopping this movement. He began to shift his strategy, focusing not on external persecution, but on internal division. He whispered to the leaders of the church, sowing seeds of pride and jealousy. He encouraged disputes over doctrine and practice, knowing that if he could divide them from within, he could weaken their unity. And indeed, conflicts arose. Arguments over theological interpretation, over leadership, over the role of Jewish law in the Christian faith. All of these issues began to surface. Satan saw these divisions as opportunities, and he fanned the flames of discord wherever he could. But even in the face of these challenges, the church continued to grow. The message of Jesus' love, of his sacrifice and resurrection was too powerful to be undone by Satan's schemes. He had underestimated the strength of this new faith, and though he would never admit it, he began to realize that the battle for humanity's soul had shifted in ways he had not anticipated. The early church was not just a movement, it was the beginning of a new era. As centuries passed, Satan continued to fight against the rising tide of Christianity. Despite persecution, division, and his efforts to corrupt its leaders, the church grew in influence and numbers. The Roman Empire, once the symbol of power and authority, began to waver under the weight of this new faith. Satan watched with increasing frustration as more and more people turned to Christ, abandoning the old gods and rejecting the fear he had so carefully nurtured. But then, something happened that Satan had not anticipated. Something that changed the course of history. A Roman emperor named Constantine rose to power, and with him came a pivotal moment for the Christian faith. Constantine was a pragmatic ruler, and Satan had long influenced the minds of such men. His ambition was boundless, his desire for control absolute. But Constantine was different from the emperors who had come before him. He was curious about this new faith that had spread across his empire, and he sought to understand its power. He knew that the Roman Empire was divided politically, religiously, and culturally, and he was looking for a way to unify it.